Hey, everybody, welcome to a brand new episode of the Hemmings Hot Rod BBQ Podcast. I am Mike Musto, together with my colleague Dan Strohl from Hemmings. And today, we're going to cover a couple of different topics. We're going to cover electrifying old cars. Can you do it on a budget? And I'm going to talk a little bit about a recent trip a buddy of mine took up from Los Angeles to San Francisco in a Rivian and how kind of well it went. Dan, how you doing today, buddy?
Okay. How about you?
Doing good, dude. How is the weather up in Bennington, Vermont? Because Dan is located in Bennington at our Hemmings headquarters. How is it up there?
It's spring is on its way. Maybe we might have another mud season or two before we can actually go out without a coat on. But
okay, I love the fact that you actually call it mud season. Is that is that like a thing? Like mud season?
Yeah. You haven't been up here through a mud season yet?
No, but I'm intrigued. So what actually is mud season?
Mud season is that shoulder season between winter and spring when it's like, there's still a bunch of slush and crap on the ground. They haven't cleared off the parking lots of all the salts yet, and everything's just muddy and yucky and nothing's blooming. But at least you're not going to get hammered with another 3 feet of snow again.
Right. So is it safe to say that any classic collectible old cars are still in the garages at this point?
Pretty much. I mean, there's a couple of hardcore guys who will just drive them year round up here, and hats off to them, but they don't get to do it for very long with with a car.
Right. Well, in this episode, I mean, I know you're a proponent of kind of electrification and doing a lot of things with older vehicles, and I thought it'd be a good idea to talk about that. There have been a lot of different opinions on electrifying old vehicles. Should you do it? Can you do it? What does it cost to do it? Right? Can you do it on a budget? And I think, people are very split on this. I used to be very hardcore. No, I don't think it's a good idea. But the more I looked and the more I kind of researched, the more I'm like, it's okay, but only, and again, I'm speaking for myself, it's okay, but only in certain situations. So what is your opinion on this?
Yeah, I mean, I've obviously heard it from all sides. I've been, building my Chenowth EV project and, putting updates out there. And, I always hear about it from the guys who are like, this is really cool. This is something that, maybe I'll even want to try to do someday. To the guys who are like, EVs are BS and, nobody should ever put an electric motor in a car and it, kills the soul of it and yada, yada. It's like,
right.
I mean, obviously I wouldn't go electrify, a Gullwing.
Right. Sure.
Something that's, irreplaceable and something that, has that strong connection between, the car and its drivetrain. A Hemi Daytona, obviously not.
Right.
But on the flip side of things, how many cars out there were built with slant 6s and 318s, and how many clone Hemi Daytonas can we actually make?
Right. Yeah.
So and there's plenty of great engineering that's going on. It's not like you just put a hair dryer motor in there and call it good. There's a lot to consider with EVs. How are you going to get that power to the ground? You're going to use the stock drive system from a Tesla, or are you going to try and put it through your stock transmission? And then, you got cooling to consider, you got charging to consider. So, and a lot of times it's very tough to incorporate everything that's baked into a modern EV into an older car. And so, the guys who are, taking all those features and putting them into an older car and giving it the usefulness of, say, a modern Tesla or a modern Leaf, those guys are just as much engineers, hardcore DIY guys as the guys who are, putting together hot rods in their garage.
Oh, no question. Well, tell us a little bit about the project that you're working on.
Sure. So, I wanted to get into EVs for a while, but I'm perennially broke, so there's never any chance of me buying a new EV, and especially not buying one and then playing around with it and modifying it, because I can't help but tinker and wrench
Right.
things. So my idea was, there's a lot of resto mods that are going on these days. It's getting real popular. I've seen what some of these guys do. Like they just take, essentially entire drivetrains out of Teslas or Leafs and
Sure.
drop them into older cars. And there's no, I mean, there are kits coming on the market for that, especially in the last couple of years. But at the time I started in the middle of the pandemic. I had just gotten rid of my my previous project, which is a 79 AMX that I put a 4-liter into.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had the garage space, and I wanted to do something, that I can do myself.
Sure.
I want to learn about it. I want to get hands on with it. And then, and I want it to be inexpensive. And here in Vermont, rust is always a problem. Finding a good, clean, older vehicle is frustrating. So I figured, why not go with a vehicle that doesn't have a body, like a sandrail, and there's no potential for rusty body.
Yeah, that's a great idea, actually. It's a brilliant idea.
Yeah, and you can make them street legal, so why not? So I found a sandrail about an hour from here. It was one of those perennial project cars. I think somebody bought it to as a kit, and and they never finished it. The guy he sold it to never finished it, and so on and so on. I think it was sitting for a dozen years in some guy's backyard when I got it. I got it for $1,000. It came with the Volkswagen components, and I started going through those. Jim Howe, who longtime readers of Hemmings would recognize his name. He's a big Volkswagen guy, and he had plenty of spare parts and let me dig through. And then I went and found a Nissan Leaf. It was a 2011 Nissan Leaf.
Sure.
It was in a junkyard, but it hadn't been wrecked. It was just in the junkyard because the battery it's 10 years old, so the battery had been depleted. But looking at it, it hadn't been depleted so far that it wouldn't still be useful. Yeah. And so I figured, well, I'll buy that. I bought it cheap, bought it for $6,000 for running, driving.
Sure.
Nissan Leaf, that's pretty good. Took everything I needed out of it: motor, batteries, controller, all the electronics, documented it all, and then got rid of the shell and started putting those components into the Chenowth. Had to adapt the Leaf motor to the Volkswagen transmission. I'm right now in the process of building battery boxes to distribute the batteries throughout the chassis of the sandrail.
Okay. Has it been, because it's a sandrail, right? I think that's a brilliant idea. The access to everything is, there is no body. It's basically plumbing equipment with an EV motor attached to it, right? So I would imagine that just being able to get to everything, to figure out how to fabricate up everything onto the chassis itself would be great. And then if you wanted later on, like if you wanted to fabricate some body panels for it, you probably could, no?
Absolutely. Yeah. They had, a lot of the desert racers use fiberglass body panels, and those are easy to find. So yeah, I could definitely put that in at one point. And yeah, it's great because it's a Chenoweth sandrail. Nobody really cares about authenticity or correctness unless it was an actual desert racer back in the day, and this obviously wasn't. So I can weld tabs here and modify it however I need to fit all those components. Probably the one downside of doing this is that everything is exposed. So like those batteries, you don't want them just hanging out there. Like if you were putting battery box into any other regular car, you could probably just build a frame for the battery box, drop it in the trunk. You're good. It's not exposed to the elements.
Sure.
With this, I got to worry about rocks getting kicked up, punching through the battery components. So I've got to be real cognizant of that when I'm building my battery boxes, and making sure it's all protected. But beyond that, like you said, it's all right there. It's easy to access. I do have to make sure, like if I'm going to be taking the neighborhood kids around the block in it, I got to make sure that there's nothing they can touch or they get zapped. That's 400 volts of DC.
How you doing?
Exactly.
So let me ask you, what's your expectation for it? Like, is this kind of, I'm assuming, your first EV project? Is this a project that it's to just familiarize yourself with how the components work, as basically just an educational tool for yourself?
Pretty much. Yeah. It's one of those things like if you're in a job interview, they ask you how you best learn. I always answer it's hands on. I
Right.
mean, I can read about stuff all day. I kind of absorb it that way, but
Yeah.
unless you actually, get to touch these components, get to see what they look
Right.
like, see how the connectors fit, and see when inevitably something's going to fail and I'm going to have to
Right.
troubleshoot it. I'll
Right.
learn so much more that way than by book reading and going into places and just saying, oh yep, it's just like this, and
Right.
and everybody looks at you like, oh, yeah, you've never done anything like this, have you?
Right. Well, that really kind of brings us to, we talk about electrifying older vehicles, right? I mean, you're obviously doing with the rail. Um, what about those that want to do full EV swaps? And like, we've seen there are a couple of out there running, right? And some of the manufacturers like GM has their E-Crate system that you can buy, and people are really starting to get into doing Tesla swaps now, which is great. And to your point, the Leaf, like I have a friend that's doing a Leaf swap into a Boxster. So there are definitely some projects that are out there. When I look at it, and you had mentioned this earlier, like you're not going to swap the heart and soul out of it. But what if an older vehicle never really had a great heart and soul to begin with? Like then I think it's totally fine. Like when I think of old Cadillacs, right? They were never performance vehicles. If you're talking about Cadillacs in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even, through the 70s, I mean, doing a really good EV swap in a chassis that can support every battery on the planet, kind of makes sense because you're just cruising low and slow in those things anyway.
Exactly. Yeah. A buddy of mine showed me a classified for an EV swapped Maserati biturbo, and I'm like, that is the most that is the thing you
Perfect.
can makes most sense with one of those vehicles,
Oh, well, that
because
car's a shitbox out of the gate. In fact, I don't even think I've ever seen one running under its own, petrol powered, engine.
exactly. Exactly. So you take the worst part out of it. It's still a good looking car.
Sure.
It's still a sports car, and it's got that
Yeah.
Maserati cachet. But take the worst part out of it, put in something that's immensely reliable, and I don't think there might be half a dozen guys out there across the world who are attached to those
Right.
engines,
Right.
for some
Yeah,
reason or another.
masochist.
I might be stretching it there, but
Right.
for the rest of the world, who cares? Who cares if you
Right.
chuck one of those engines and put a Leaf motor or Tesla drivetrain in it? You get to drive it. You get to have fun with it, and you get to
Yeah.
put another old car back on the road where instead of just leaving it sit abandoned at some
Right.
repair shop.
Well, it's interesting you say that. Like, it used to be that say if you found, I don't know, a Mustang or whatever, it had a small block in it, had a Chevy small block, or an old Cadillac with an Oldsmobile with a Ford motor, whatever. Everybody used to be like, well, I hate you now. This is you crucified the car. My whole thing with that was, but the car's still on the road. Like if you have access, like I really don't like, yes, it's always great to see an original engine in there to an extent, but I don't understand why people have an issue with if you've got years ago I filmed a beautiful Oldsmobile, an old Cutlass back in New York, and my buddy had put in a big block Chevy in it, and everybody was like, "That's bullshit! You killed the car." And I'm like, "The car's awesome. Like the car was fabulous."
Yeah.
So there's no difference now, in my opinion, in it's fine if the original motor took a dump. Like why not do an EV swap again if the vehicle warrants it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a correlation I think is EFI. 20 years
Sure.
ago, if you were putting an EFI on a car, people were like, what the hell, man? Why didn't you keep the original carburetor? It's awesome that way. You didn't need to do this. And in the years since, people have, been turned on to EFI. They're like, oh, it does make sense. There's, more kits out there. Makes it a lot easier to to not only install but also tune it. Right. And so nowadays, you go to a car show and nobody's batting an eye at EFI. They're if anything, they're like, oh, hey, can you tell me, where you got that and how much you spent on it? Because everybody's interested in it. I think the same thing will happen to EVs. Obviously there are cases where, if you've got a 4-barrel or a dual quad car, that was built like that originally. And if it's a rear engine, obviously you're going to keep it stock as much as possible.
Sure.
But again, like we said earlier, if it's a 318 car, you're not attached to the engine, and exactly, nobody's going to bat an eye in 5-10 years. In fact, they're going to be more interested in, like, hey, who'd you get to do your swap? Did you do it yourself? What'd you use?
Absolutely. Well, and that's, your EFI to carburation is a great example, right? Now it's almost like you go to a car show, and if you have a carburetor, you're kind of the guy that's on the outskirts.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's funny. I'm my 68 Charger. I'm going to pick that up this weekend. It's been away for a year getting mechanically redone. And everybody had asked me, they said, are you going EFI on this car? And I said, actually, I'm not. It's had an 800 double pumper on it for the last 15 years. It runs beautifully. And just because you can, it doesn't mean you have to.
Sure.
And I like that car. For me, it's always one of those. I always said that car will always have a big block, and it will always have a carburetor in it. And I think there's something to that from the nostalgia aspect, especially if it's a great running car, right? Mm-hmm. I think that makes a big difference. But yes, EFI systems now, they're relatively inexpensive. You can do it in an afternoon with a friend if you're handy. And they do work. It's not like you said, 15 years ago, you were trying to figure this out, and it was like a mad science. Like if you saw somebody with like an old car with EFI, you're like, whoa,
yeah,
this guy is a rocket scientist. Now it's like, oh, he just went to Holly. So, which is
yeah, nothing wrong with that.
Not at all. It's interesting though, talking about kind of EVs and not just the swaps. I had a very good friend of mine, my friend Derek Powell, and Derek is a journalist and a producer. And he had pinged me last week, and he had said, he goes, listen, I found this car up by you. Could you go take a look at it? And it was a small little Fiat 500e. Okay. 22,000 mile little runabout. And he was like, I just need it for my commute in the morning to go 8 miles or 10 miles every day, like back and forth to work, because he was driving a car that was a manual in LA traffic. He was like, it was a pain in the ass. And I said, sure. So I went, look, car checked out, beautiful little bugger. You know what I mean? So he said, I'm going to come pick it up on Sunday. I said, sure. How are you coming to pick it up? He was like, well, I'm borrowing my buddy's Rivian. I'm going to hook my trailer up to it. I'm going to come up to LA or come up to San Francisco and then turn around and go back. Now, from LA to SF, it's about 400 miles. Okay. How many? Now, mind you, it's full size Rivian. I think it was an RT1, the pickup truck. Towing an aluminum trailer, which weighed about 900 pounds. Beautiful trailer. How many times do you think it took him? How many gas or charge stops do you think it took him?
Well, I mean, you told me before we started, so I already know, but
yeah.
But if you hadn't told me, I'd say, maybe, gosh, I don't know the range of those off the top of my head, but maybe 1, maybe 2 at the at the most to get up there. Yeah.
Right. And we both know that. So just to give everybody an idea, Rivian, I believe, has like 300 mile range, supposedly a 300 mile range. Towing the trailer, again, a 900 pound trailer on the highway, okay, cruising at 70, 75 miles an hour, that range dropped to about 170 miles, 150 miles. Okay. So he had to stop 3 times. Now, when you stop, that's minimum 45 minutes to an hour and a half if you have a DC fast charger, right? So a journey that should have taken him 4 or I would say 5.5 hours was at least 9 hours, right? Wow. Then when we got here, there's a fast charger right by my house. We said, okay, let's just go hook it up to that. You get some juice in this thing. Well, one, couldn't hook up because the credit card machine wouldn't sync up. Then the accountant wouldn't work. Then when the app on the phone wouldn't work. And I looked and I was like, is it worth it? And he was like, listen, man, this is a straight up experiment. And my friend Derek, he is a diehard petrol guy. He's got a beautiful 1970 Torino. He's got a wonderful Porsche that he races. Like, this is a guy that knows cars inside and out, but he wanted to do this experiment to see how it would actually work. It was enlightening, to say the least, because towing the car back, his range dropped to about 125 miles, 100 miles per charge. So when we look at all these things like the big Ford Lightning, the Rivian, the Chevy Helmer, all the, the Jim, whatever it is. I don't care what anyone says. For everyday use around town, fine. But if you live somebody where you have to go distance and you have to use these vehicles, these trucks, as a work truck, they're just not ready yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got a couple problems there. For the last several years as electric trucks have been coming on the market, it's consistently, everybody says you put a trailer, the minute you hook a trailer up, your range goes down by half. And that bears it out with those numbers that you're telling me there. And so yeah, there's a definite problem there, because I mean, what do people get a truck for other than to, have that capability to throw a trailer on it and go do stuff? I mean, that's why I've got a pickup truck,
right?
Because my Magnum doesn't tow anything more than a utility trailer. Right. But yeah, the second problem is, and I know I'm sure Terry McGeehan has talked about it on this podcast before, is the problem of charging when you're away from home. I mean, charging at home, that's how most charging gets done.
Correct.
It's not a problem. But if you're trying to take a trip, and if you're not in a Tesla within range of those supercharger networks, it's going to be very difficult. Because there's, I mean, how many different charging companies, how many different charging networks are there out there?
Absolutely.
Different login, a different app, for every single one of them. And it's almost like, it completely doesn't jive with what we expect, because, we expect where we can pull up on a road trip with an internal combustion car, we can pull up to any fuel station, and it doesn't matter what brand it is. We can use our card easy enough, fill up, not have to sign up for an app and keep track of another password, for heaven's sake. So, there is, people have identified that as a problem, huge problem to EV adoption. Until that's solved, I don't think EV adoption is going to really take off. It's gonna be incremental the way it is now.
What was interesting, like what was cool was seeing so like my buddy had that Rivian, which is top of the line, $100,000 plus, whatever it is, pickup truck, right? But then the used vehicle he bought was, again, that Fiat 500e. And what I thought was really interesting was that the pickup truck, the Rivian, misses the mark. It just does. If it's a lifestyle truck, that's great, as long as your lifestyle is in with a 150-mile radius of your home. Okay. Now, the 500e, and I hadn't driven one in years. And then I drove this and I was like, you know what? This makes sense. And there were a couple of things that struck me on it. One, the 500e has a key, an actual flip open key. Doesn't really do anything, but you turn it in, turn the button, and the car is on, right? As opposed to a start button or proximity system that, like the Rivian, where if you have the key in your pocket, you just immediately get in and the thing just starts up, right? It just starts up. But the Fiat had an actual key. It had a pull-up parking brake, an old school parking brake lever in it. And I was like, this works. It made sense. And it wasn't trying to be anything it's not, whereby 100-mile range, right, or 90-mile range, or whatever it has, it was the perfect neighborhood runabout to go out and do errands and everything else, right? Where the Rivian just wasn't there. Yeah. And as beautiful as it was and as expensive as it was, again, I'm just wondering if people are going to go, you know what, we need another 10 to 15 years worth of battery, or 10 years worth of battery development before we're actually going to see pickups being able to be used in the sense that they can be for construction, for work, for, adventure. And in the same way that that little Fiat is used as a around town vehicle,
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of checks being written by the manufacturer of these EVs there that they can't cash. It's interesting you mentioned all those kind of manual features for the 500e, and I think that's what's really missing. It's what's making it so hard for car enthusiasts to get into newer vehicles, is that you look at something like the Rivian, like Teslas. And they're, sure, they have, car designers and they have car engineers on staff, but they're not being designed and built as cars. They're being designed and built as software on wheels. So, everything's electronic. Even with that Leaf that I took apart, the park and brake was just a button, just an electronic button.
Right. Sure.
To car guys like us, we like the tactile, we like the
right,
the hands-on, the sensory, aspect of old cars. And this software on wheels approach takes a lot of that away, and it makes it really hard to connect with the car. I mean, there are Tesla people who love their cars. There are Leaf people who love their cars,
which is great. Sure.
Yeah, exactly. But there's going to be enthusiasts for any car out there. There's Geo Metro enthusiasts, and
that's a shame. Yeah,
there's Chevette enthusiasts. I just wrote.
That's
about
right.
A little bit ago. But for large scale adoption, for large scale enthusiast adoption, I think having those tactile responses, having that that connection, being able to do things manually, I think would help a lot with that.
Agreed. Totally agree. So, all right, let me ask you one more question. So, talking about the kind of the span between, say, a 500e and that Rivian, right? One is super budget minded, the other is full blown expensive and luxurious and everything else. For those that want to convert a vehicle, right? Do you think you can do it on a budget? And what do you, like, if somebody says, like, for instance, you got a 318 Dart, right? You're like, I want to put a new motor in it. Well, you could probably do that for $6-8 grand. Like, even if you were to buy a brand new small block, you could probably do that if you're handy. You could drop a motor in a weekend, and for $5-6 grand, you could be done with it. What do you think the budget would be to do an EV swap? And like, you're going through it right now, right? Where do you think it is now, and then where do you think it'll be 10 years from now?
Yeah, no, that's a real good question. That's another thing that makes a big difference to a lot of people. There are shops out there that will convert a car for you, but you're gonna be hard pressed to get out of there less than 50 grand. And there's a lot of labor that goes into it. And I'm not besmirching those guys, how much they charge in labor, because it takes a lot of specialty work to go into it. I actually tallied up how much I spent on my project so far, and it's just crested $10,000.
Okay.
And that includes purchase of the sandrail, purchase of the donor leaf. I even included, I registered the leaf so I could drive it around a little bit before I took it apart, just to be familiar with it. So I included that. So everything, nuts and bolts, all that, 10 grand. And I think that I'm doing it as budget minded as possible. I'm not really throwing, crazy expensive, everything on it. And I'm using a leaf, which you could find leafs used for less than what I paid for, but they're either going to be crashed, or they're going to be, rotted out, or the batteries are just going to be totally wiped. So, this is, kind of a workable solution here. And you can go, sky's the limit if you're doing it yourself. Wrecked Teslas out of the salvage yards these days, I mean, you're spending as much for a wrecked one as you would on a brand new Leaf, that you can drive off the lot. Just because they're, those drivetrain units are in such demand, and people are getting the money for them. So it kind of all depends on obviously how much you want to spend. But doing it on a budget is, you got to mind your P's and Q's. You got to, make sure that, you're keeping it down, but, we're used to that, even if you're doing ICE cars. I think the other thing to consider is, how much of the restoration cost of the vehicle you're going to wrap into that. Like, do you have a fully restored car? You're probably going to get away with a conversion a little easier than if you got to, do some rust repair, that kind of thing.
You think there'll ever be, right now, hot rodders have been playing with wrenches and engines for the last 100 years. You think the EVs will ever have that much of a fan base that will ever, in say the next 50, 100 years, will have the same amount of enthusiasts diving into the EV side as we do to the ICE side? Or do you think that because the vehicles are so technical, and because, everybody will talk about, and even though it's not going to be here, in my opinion, for the next 25 years, 30 years, autonomous driving. Do you think you're still going to have as large as an enthusiast crowd, or do you think it's going to dwindle?
It's tough to say. I think even now we're 10 years into the Tesla era. It's still tough for people to wrap their heads around electric vehicles, for a lot of the reasons that we've talked about already. How much and how fast that'll change, I can't say.
Sure.
It all depends on, it'll kind of depend on a lot of things, including, they talked about the gasoline engine bans. California plans to have that in place by 2035. I'm
2035, sure. Yeah.
Same thing in Europe is planned on 2035. So I think it remains to be seen how seriously the car makers take that in the next 12 years, and how much they are willing to work with enthusiasts. Car makers historically did a great job of providing parts, and making sure that they did support the people who were the hardcore enthusiasts, and that trickled down to the rest of us. You mentioned the GM's E-Crate program. As far as I know, that hasn't even been made available on a widespread basis.
Right.
They have an open order books, and I think it's only really, I think Lingenfelter did one.
Yeah.
But that's the only
Hot
one
Rod did Project X a while ago,
Yeah. And even so, and this is something that I've written about a lot too. If you're talking about a crate electric motor, you're just talking about the motor. You're not talking about the battery, all the accessory, the controller, all that. That's a whole huge can of worms to get into. Ford has been selling those Illuminator, sorry.
Yep.
And motors, but I mean, have you really seen too many of those around?
No, man. The only one that I've seen that I would say is on the forefront is probably Icon, right? Mm-hmm. Jonathan Ward is building, the EV derelicts, and they work. I feel like anything that Icon does just kind of works. Like they've got to figure out, but you're going to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for that. Which, let me tell you something, if you have the budget and that's what you want, then God bless. I mean, I feel like, I don't know, 15 years ago, if you were to say I've got $100,000 in my hot rod, people would lose their minds and be like, that's crazy, 6 figures. I feel like now we're at the point where it's like, oh, you got $500,000 in that. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's crazy when you think about that.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about, how inflation and labor rates and brick and mortar structures and technology and tools and all this stuff, how much they all cost, you go, yeah, you can't build anything. You're not building anything for 15 grand anymore. I'm sorry. Yeah. Like, unless you're doing the work yourself, like a paint job, a good paint job is 30 grand.
Yeah. And I think that's why, over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen this huge rise in patina, in barn finds, because people are, saying, well, do I really need a paint job for this? Even though, the paint's a little scuffed here and there, but, it's got some character, and, so they turn it into a positive in that way. So, but yeah, I mean, that's exactly why, because that it's not like this is robbery here, because, the guys who are running paint booths, they're paying out the nose for just a gallon of paint.
Just the material. And it's really interesting. I think if you grew up in the 70s, the 80s, right? Like I did, you remember things like Earl Shaw's, right? And all these old paint places be like, we'll paint your whole car for $99. And they would paint the whole car for $99. Like, if you didn't tape
windows and all,
it was painted. But now a gallon of paint is hundreds of dollars. And then you talk about clear, and then you talk about hardener and mixing and body work and everything like that. And so I always tell everybody, I'm like, do not build, just buy. Do not build your own car. You'll go broke. Just go buy something that's done, and then fix whatever shit's wrong. Right. But yeah, but the EV is an interesting idea to me. Right. If it ever got cheap enough where you could buy like a T bucket and dress it up and put an EV motor in it, I mean, it might make sense in the same way that you're doing the Chenowth, right? Where it's everything is accessible. It's a big tube chassis that you can see what I mean. A T bucket's pretty much the same thing for the most part, right?
Mhm.
I could see that. I'm just wondering if the younger enthusiast is going to jump on that bandwagon and be like, yeah, this is cool. I like this.
I think so. I mean, you look at the guys who grew up in the era of tuner cars, they wouldn't know what a carburetor looked like,
No, that's true. Sure.
And meanwhile, you've got the old guys who still have their VCRs set into blinking 12 o'clock. So it's all about what people grow up with, and I think it's tough to envision things becoming EVs becoming widespread enthusiast vehicles right now, just because they don't have that market share.
Sure.
I think it's still in the single digits in a lot of places. It might be over in 10%, 15% where you are, but like here in Vermont, it's still like, oh, hey, that's an EV.
Right.
I haven't seen one of those in a while. So until you have that base, until you have guys working on these as used cars, you're not really going to see that enthusiast awakening.
It's a great point.
If 2035 actually brings a sea change in electric vehicles, and then by 2050 you've got all these used EVs in junkyards for relatively affordable prices, I think that's when you're going to start to see the enthusiasts pick up on it. So.
No, totally agree. All right, well, Dan, where can everyone, for those, obviously, if you're going to go to Hemmings, you've read Dan for years, one of the greatest writers that we've ever had, amazing historian, builder, the whole deal. But what are you working on now? What stories? What do you, for Hemmings and stuff? What do you got in the pike?
On a related topic, I'm working on an in-depth dive into synthetic fuels. I think a lot of us have heard about Porsche's work with synthetic fuels, and they think that's really the way to keep enthusiasts into cars. But I think a lot of people don't really realize what synthetic fuels are, how they're produced, why it's such a big thing. So, take a look into that now. Just kind of the normal ebb and flow of things. Jeep's got some Easter Jeep Safari concepts coming out, and I always love taking a look at that. I love when they take older Jeeps and resto mod them. So there's just a little bit of everything going on right now.
Good. All right. Well, dude, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's always a pleasure to chat. And, for everybody out there that's listening, obviously, if you're looking for that collector car, potentially a motor swap, EV swap, whatever, we've got, just go to Hemmings.com. We've got like 25,000 cars in our marketplace. We've got an auction. We've got the whole deal. So, and we've got, my God, we still got the big books that has every part that you could ever want for your classic and collectible, which is really cool.
Except for e-crates.
Except for e-crates. Not yet. That'll be in the next 65 years in business. We'll finally start getting e-crates.
And if anybody's out there doing a cool EV conversion, or if you're working with a vintage EV, look me up. I'd love to talk about it with you. Absolutely.
And please actually do that. Because knowing Dan, he will do a deep dive in whatever you're building, which would be really cool to read about and see on the Hemmings site. So otherwise, sir, that's it. I just appreciate you coming on, man. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for having me. Love to talk anytime.
Very good. All right, everybody. We'll see you next time on the Hot Rod BBQ. Thanks for listening, folks. And again, please subscribe to the Hot Rod BBQ podcast. If you're on Spotify, check us out there. Subscribe to it on iTunes. And if you are going to go to YouTube, make sure you go to the Hot Rod BBQ podcast and hit that subscribe button, and we'll come to you every week.